Welcome back. Thank you very much for staying with us. So today marks 150 consecutive days of uninterrupted power supply since 26 March 2024. Eskom has maintained a constant electricity supply throughout its winter period with no load shedding since the start of its current financial year on the 1st of April 2024. Eskom says since the 1st of April of this year to the 22nd of August, diesel expenditure has also been reduced by 10.60 billion, representing approximately a 75% decrease compared to the same period last year. Joining us to discuss this further is energy analyst Professor Hartmut Winkler. Good afternoon, Professor. Thank you very much for joining us on The Full View. You know, in the ideal world, 150 days of uninterrupted power supply wouldn't be celebrated, it would be the norm. But given what South Africans have experienced, they're overjoyed. Your views on Eskom's spectacular turnaround?
Yes, it surprised absolutely everybody. I made the prediction about 6 months ago that we would be having load shedding almost the whole time this winter. It hasn't happened. It even surprised Eskom themselves. If you look at Eskom's projections at the beginning of the year, where we were going to be, how much load shedding they were expecting, it was also very bad. Even their best case scenario ended up being, well, they've exceeded their best case scenario by quite a bit.
There was a lot of skepticism. I mean, others even thought this was probably a campaigning mechanism on the part of the African National Congress, thinking that immediately after those elections, they were going to experience load shedding. It hasn't happened. 150 days uninterrupted power supply. What can we attribute this to now? Because we keep hearing that this performance is due to aggressive maintenance that started in December. Is it solely the maintenance, or perhaps they've had some sort of relief because of a number of businesses and residents that use solar now?
A bit of everything. I think the biggest difference has been that they are now able to draw on 3 units at Kusile Power Station, which were down this time last year. And that in itself is about 2 stages of load shedding. When those came back in October last year, that really made a big difference. The solar is making a difference, but I would say only about 1 stage of load shedding compared to what we would have had about a year ago. Because even though there really has been a lot of solar coming online domestically on business and so on, if you add it all up, it only comes to about 1 stage of load shedding. The fact that they have been doing this maintenance, that certainly is helping. The number of breakdowns are down considerably. If one looks at the number of breakdowns they had before, it was really shocking. It was something of the region of about 50% of their coal plants were down at any particular time. I mean, that is just that is a disaster, whichever way you look at it. And even though they're far from perfect at the moment, the fact that they've been able to lower the breakdowns a bit means that we're now in the situation that we are. They could still improve more, but I think what they've done is absolutely astonishing. And I don't think one can isolate a single individual and say, oh, it was the new CEO. The new CEO came in quite late, so they wouldn't have made a huge difference. Is it the new minister? The minister did help a bit because he certainly built a much better relationship with Eskom. Before that, there was a lot of tension between Minister Mantashe and the Eskom leadership. And I think that also affected things negatively.
And perhaps just having that being a portfolio on its own, that we now have an electricity ministry, but also a minister who was then driving this energy action plan, which seems to be yielding the desired results. But Eskom has also spoken about the difference that has come with partnering with the original equipment manufacturers. Now, this wasn't an easy decision to take, given that over the years, Eskom had moved away from using original equipment manufacturers, citing costs, but also, as we know, the country such as the one we live in, there's always a need to support small and medium businesses. So your views on just that very tough decision to move back to the OEMs? Okay.
Certainly this turnaround came at a cost, no question about it. To do these repair jobs properly means that you are going to need quite a bit of money. But I think Treasury helped Eskom quite a bit when they indicated that they were going to be assisting at least to lower their current debt at the moment. So it also helps, as you mentioned earlier, that is once your plants start performing better, it means that you're not in this mad rush to get things fixed. In other words, you don't your repairs actually end up being a little bit cheaper because you can do them properly and more slowly. You don't need to bring in somebody on the weekend, And the fact that they're not using diesel, you mentioned the figure.
Yeah.
Something like 10 billion. That is quite a bit.
But it was nevertheless still controversial because there was great debate around it that if you're going to have Eskom move away from seeing the need to empower these small businesses and going to the original manufacturers, it would be problematic. But it seems, though, like we say, that it has yielded the results. They even mentioned it in their statement that it is among the reasons that we've seen this consecutive power supply of late, purely because they took the decision that we need to go to the original manufacturers and have them being the ones that maintain these boilers and everything else.
Yeah, I'm sure a lot of the small business that Eskom was using in the past were doing a perfectly good job in that. But on the other hand, there were also quite a lot of instances where people are really just using the fact that there is a big organization with lots of money and they didn't have a particularly good way of monitoring the situation. If somebody comes and does a repair job, to what extent can you hold them accountable if the thing breaks down again a month later, which is what happened very often. I think they've moved more towards service level agreements where whoever does the repair work knows that if they don't do this thoroughly, they're just simply going to have to come back and redo things at their own costs. So that would have made a difference. In the past, there actually was an incentive for power stations not to have frequent breakdowns because it meant that a lot of companies would suddenly get a lot more work. And of course, this whole issue of sabotage, which has been thrown about, would be a situation where simply you'll find some unscrupulous companies are simply just creating more breakdowns because it means more work for them. I'm not saying they're all like that. I think some companies were perfectly honest in that, but I think there was that element.
And then just in closing, I wanted to touch on the load reduction that's hitting townships quite badly because you find most residents are saying they would be without electricity for 4 to 5 hours. And they deeply agree, feeling as though this is perhaps a disguised way of implementing load shedding, but for them specifically because they're in the townships and there's little protest or whatever the case may be. Just your views on just that amount where people would be without electricity in excess of 5 or 6 hours.
Okay, Eskom's argument will be that this is not driven by non-payment and so on, but rather by the fact that some sections of the electricity network are just simply overloaded at the very ends. Because what happens is that the power comes it gets transported at very high voltages, and gradually at each substation it gets lowered to a lower voltage until it reaches the 220 volts that we use in our household. And so if somewhere down the line you just have too much power being drawn, it's going to then endanger those particular substations. If they draw too much power, it just means that the chance of a fire there it just increases. So one can make that argument. On the other hand, the cynics would say, well, it's a very convenient way for Eskom to deal with the fact that a lot of people aren't paying, and so effectively they are passing the burden to areas where they traditionally have very bad collection of revenue.
Would it compromise the infrastructure if they were to reduce the amount of hours that people are without electricity, perhaps to say 2 hours at any given period or 3 hours? Because some of them are complaining that it would be 6 hours straight, so it's difficult to even cook or do anything.
Yes, well, it would normally be done at the times when there's peak consumption. So that tends to happen to be early evening until about 9 or 10 o'clock. So that's where if it's at any other time, it wouldn't make sense. But that is a time when maximum power gets drawn. And yes, the load reduction also does assist Eskom because normally they have to make sure there's enough power stations or enough power coming in to get them over that early evening peak. So if the early evening peak is lower simply because some areas are being cut off, it actually assists Eskom as well.
Professor, thank you very much for your time this afternoon. That's energy analyst Professor Hartmut Winkler speaking to us.